everyone. I'm Dr. Matt Munger, and this is another episode of The Bible Was Written Backwards. This is part 3 in a series on biblical law. In the first video, I talked about the way the 3 law codes of the Bible show a process of development, rewriting, and recontextualization. In the second video, I looked at the ancient Near Eastern sources behind the oldest of the biblical law codes, the Covenant Code of Exodus 20 to 23, and focused on the law of Hammurabi. In this final installment of the series, I want to turn our attention to the book of Deuteronomy. We will look at the way that this book was structured following a different type of ancient Near Eastern document, what we call a suzerain vassal treaty. But before we get into that, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the book of Deuteronomy on its own. As I've noted before, the book of Deuteronomy is one of the later traditions of the law that we find in the Hebrew Bible. It is abundantly clear for a number of reasons that Deuteronomy rewrites early traditions known especially from Exodus. There's been some debate about the dating of Deuteronomy in recent years. Most scholars do agree on the relative chronology of the sources. Deuteronomy comes somewhere between the oldest layers of Exodus and the later priestly layers, which are revisions and laws. For many years, the text of Deuteronomy was connected not to the time of Moses, but rather to the time of Josiah, king of Judah, so between 640 and 609 BCE. The reason for this is a story in the book of 2 Kings 22 to 23 about how during Josiah's reign, a book of the law was found in the temple, and the subsequent reforms that take place under Josiah's direction. The key text here is 2 Kings 23, 1 through 3. Then the king directed that all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem should be gathered to him. The king went up to the house of the Lord, and with him went all the people of Judah, all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests, the prophets, and all the people, both great and small. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant that had been found in the house of the Lord. The king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord, to follow the Lord, keeping his commandments, his decrees, and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul, and to perform the words of the covenant as they were written in the book. And all the people joined in the covenant. Following this is a lengthy description of what is done, the way that they destroyed the temples and altars to Baal, removed the Asherah poles, and kicked them out of the temple, and they destroyed all the other sanctuaries to God outside the Temple of Jerusalem. This description fits the regulations in Deuteronomy, in opposition to what is written in the earlier law codes. Thus, scholars have long connected the events described in the Book of Kings with the law code found in the Book of Deuteronomy. Now, this seems very likely to be the case within the narrative itself, but it is much harder to say whether there was an actual reform and an actual book of the law similar to Deuteronomy found during that time. More important is the fact that there seems to be a clearly defined literary and theological writer, school, or group that is responsible for the book of Deuteronomy and the story about Josiah's reform. In any case, the idea of the need to only worship one God in one place and to cast out all other gods is used as an important explanation in the Book of Kings for why Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians. Another reason that we can say the Book of Deuteronomy is secondary is found in the narrative itself. The storyline of Deuteronomy presents the text as a speech by Moses, as the Israelites are on the brink of moving into the Promised Land. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan, in the wilderness, on the plain opposite Suf, between Paran, Tophel, Laban, Hazerot, and Di Zahab. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the Israelites just as the Lord had commanded him to speak. And beyond the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this law as follows. The narrative frames this as a retelling of the events that has just happened, followed by a law code, which in the text is interpreted as a covenant between God and Israel. Placing this new law code in the mouth of Moses in a new narrative situation is a literary device that gives the author of or authors of the text a framework for updating the laws. Now, what is interesting in this context of updating the laws into a new narrative framework is the literary form that it takes. In fact, when we look at the basic structure of the Book of Deuteronomy, it is composed in a style that reflects other ancient Near Eastern treaties between a powerful king or state, called a suzerain, and a vassal, which is a weaker king or state. The clearest parallels are found in Hittite treaties from the second millennium, but we see the pattern in several different treaties from a broad span of time in the ancient Near East. The treaties were discovered at the ancient Hittite capital of Hattusa, which is found in modern-day Turkey, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Now, for those who need a refresher, the Hittites were one of the great powers of the Bronze Age in West Asia, having control of what is now Turkey for large parts of the second millennium BCE. They were located northwest of the Assyrian Empire and were widely known in the region, which is reflected by the fact that we have treaties between the Hittites and Ramses II of Egypt. The Hittites are often mentioned in the Bible as one of the people groups that Israel had to battle against when settling the land. The text of the Hittite treaties were not published until the middle of the 1900s. George Mendenhall, in 1954, published an article popularizing the Hittite treaties and showing that the form of Deuteronomy is comparable to the ancient Near Eastern legal treaties. He also argues that these treaties were well known in the region, with an example of treaties between the Hittites and Egypt, as well as with the peoples of Syria. Mendenhall points to a clear structure in these Hittite treaties, which we will look at here. Let's look at an example of one of the Hittite treaties before we go into a comparison with the Book of Deuteronomy. The preamble identifies the author-speaker and their authority. In the case of the Hittite treaties, the king with the support of his gods. The historical prologue then describes the history of the relationship between the parties in the treaty. Then come the stipulations, which define the obligations of the vassal towards the suzerain. This includes obligations of loyalty to the suzerain and the prohibition of allegiance to other peoples. Following this, there is often a provision for depositing a copy of the treaty in the temple and a requirement to read it publicly on occasion. The treaty then includes a list of witnesses in the form of gods, and then spells out the blessings and curses that will come to the vassal if they keep or fail to keep the treaty. So let's look briefly at some of the text from one of the Hittite treaties that illustrates this. This is from the treaty between Mursilis and Dupi-Teshub of Amuru, which is extant in both Hittite and Akkadian copies, all found in the Hittite capital of Hattusa. The preamble reads like this: "These are the words of the son Mursilis, the great king, the king of Hattiland, the valiant, the favorite of Storm God, the son of Supi-Luliumas, the great king, the king of the Hattiland, the valiant." Then comes the historical prologue. "Aziras was the grandfather of Dupi-Teshub. He rebelled against my father, but submitted again to my father. When the kings of Nuhasiland and the kings of Kinza rebelled against my father, Aziras did not rebel. He was bound by the treaty, and he remained bound by treaty. As my father fought against his enemies, in the same manner fought Aziras. Aziras remained loyal to my father. Aziras remained loyal to my father as his overlord, and did not incite my father's anger. My father was loyal towards Aziras and his country. He did not undertake any unjust action against him, or incite his or his country's anger in any way. 300 shekels of refined and first-class gold, the tribute which my father had imposed upon your father, he brought year for year. He never refused it." So that sums up the history of the relationship between the two lands. And now come the stipulations for the current treaty. "The tribute which was imposed upon your grandfather and your father, they presented 300 shekels of good, refined, first-class gold, weighed with standard weights. You shall present them likewise. Do not turn your eyes to anyone else. Your fathers presented tribute to Egypt. You shall not do that. With my friend, you shall be friend, and with my enemy, you shall be enemy. As I, the son, am loyal to you, do you extend military help to the son in the Hatti land. If any of the deportees from the Nuhasi land, or of the deportees from the country of Kinza, whom my father removed and myself removed, escapes, and comes to you, if you do not seize him and turn him back to the king of the Hatti land, and even tell him as follows, where you are going to, I do not want to know. You act in disregard of your oath. This particular treaty is lacking a provision to store and read the treaty, but we'll look at an example of that below. The list of gods as witnesses comes next. Here we have the sun god of heaven, the sun goddess Arina, the storm god of heaven, the Hattian storm god, Ceres and Huris, Mount Nani and Mount Hazi. Let these be witnesses to this treaty and to the oath. And finally comes a set of blessings and curses for those who follow or don't follow the treaty. The words of the treaty and the oaths that are described on this tablet, should Dupi Tesub not honor these words of the treaty and the oath, may these gods and the oath destroy Dupi Tesub together with his person, his wife, his son, his grandson, his house, his land, and together with everything that he owns. But if Dupi Tesub honors these words and the treaty and the oath that are described on this tablet, may these gods of the oath protect him together with his person, his wife, his son, his grandson, his house, and his country. In this particular oath, we didn't have a provision for depositing the treaty in a temple and public readings of it, but we find this in a number of other treaties, such as this one. A duplicate of this tablet has been deposited before the sun goddess of Arina, because the sun goddess of Arina regulates kingship and queenship. In the Mitanni land, a duplicate has been deposited before Tesub, the lord of the Kuruni of Kahat. At regular intervals shall they be read in the presence of the king of the Mitanni land and in the presence of the sons of the Huri country. So now that we see the basic structure of these Hittite treaties, I want to look at Deuteronomy, specifically looking for these elements and describing how they fit together with the Hittite treaties. We find the preamble, surprisingly enough, at the very beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. The preamble is the text that we read before the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, which describes Moses as being the speaker of these words and the location where this speaking happens. I won't repeat it all here, but this is the text. What we see is that it ends with Moses undertook to expound this law as follows. What follows is a rather lengthy historical preamble, which stretches all the way from chapter 1 through chapter 4 in the book of Deuteronomy. It begins by saying, "The Lord our God spoke to us at Horeb, saying, 'You have stayed long enough at this mountain. Resume your journey and go to the hill country of the Amorites, as well as to the neighboring regions, to Arabah, the hill country, to Shephelah, the Negeb, and the seacoast, the land of the Canaanites, and to Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river of the Euphrates. See, I have set the land before you. Go in and take possession of the land that I swore to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give to them and to their descendants after them.'" And this continues with basically the whole story of how the Israelites left Egypt and wandered through the desert and end up where they are currently in the situation where Moses is speaking to them. The stipulations of the covenant are found through this long section of laws that is found from Deuteronomy chapter 5 all the way until chapter 26. We can begin by looking at the way it begins in chapter 5. "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and ordinances that I am addressing to you today. You shall learn them and observe them diligently. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. Not with our ancestors did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. The Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain, out of the fire. At that time I was standing between the Lord and you to declare to you the words of the Lord, for you were afraid because of the fire, and did not go up the mountain." Thus follows a list of stipulations and laws that the Israelites are to follow, which is a retelling of the laws as we find them in the earlier law codes, but again, that was part of a different video. What we're interested in here is that these stipulations provide the basis for the covenant between Israel and God. They are the rules which Israel is supposed to follow in order to maintain the good graces of their suzerain, who is God. Next comes the provision for depositing the book of the law in the temple and his regular reading. Then Moses wrote down this law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the leaders of Israel. Moses commanded them every 7th year, in the scheduled year of remission, during the festival of booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. The next phase of the Hittite treaties is the list of witnesses in the terms of gods, and we also find that in the book of Deuteronomy. Here from chapter 30, verse 19. "I call heaven and earth to witness against you today, that I have set before you life and death, Blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live. Now, these blessings and curses are, of course, parallel to the next point in the Hittite Treaties, which are the blessings and curses. The same day, Moses charged the people as follows: When you have crossed the Jordan, these shall stand on Mount Gerizim for the blessing of the people: Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin. And these shall stand on Mount Ebal for the curse: Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali. Then the Levites shall declare in a loud voice to all Israel: Cursed be anyone who makes an idol or casts an image, anything abhorrent to the Lord, the work of an artisan, and sets it up in secret. And all the people shall respond, saying, Amen. If you will only obey the Lord your God by diligently observing all his commandments that I am commanding you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all nations of the earth. All these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, if you obey the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the field. Blessed shall be the fruit of your womb, the fruit of your ground, and the fruit of your livestock, both the increase of your cattle and the issue of your flock. One obvious difference between the Hittite Treaties and the book of Deuteronomy is the extent. The stipulations are much more comprehensive here than what found in the examples of suzerain and vassal treaties that we looked at above. However, the other elements match extraordinarily well. The preamble in Deuteronomy 1 introduces the leader and authority. The historical prologue stretches from Deuteronomy 1:6 through 4:49 and recapitulates everything that happened between the Exodus and the point in the narrative where the speech begins. The stipulations include the Ten Commandments, the rules and regulations of Deuteronomy 6 through 11, and the entire Deuteronomic Code, which spans chapters 12 to 26. The blessings and curses of Deuteronomy 27 and 28 come out of order compared to the Hittite texts, directly following the stipulations, but are similar in style. And the location of the witnesses and provisions for placement in the holy place and regular reading are also out of place, but also readily identifiable. All in all, the structure of Deuteronomy compared to the Hittite vassal treaties is very recognizable, as the basic purpose of the text is to establish a pact between Israel and God in the form of a covenant or treaty. Using this culturally relevant form makes perfect sense. Another dimension which strengthens the possibility of Deuteronomy using this cultural form is found in the use of the word love as a requirement for obedience from the people. As we see in Deuteronomy 6:5, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might. The idea that Israel has a pact or covenant with God is so well integrated into the text of the Hebrew Bible, it's sometimes difficult to see just how different Deuteronomy frames this. The covenant with Abraham was very different than that which Deuteronomy describes in terms of legal obligations and unequal footing. Abraham is offered blessings and given a roadmap to them. Further, when looking at the covenant code, which has the word covenant right there in it, we do find a covenant, but with a different format and structure. As we've talked about before, Deuteronomy represents a development of the covenant code, showing clear knowledge of the text. So it's worth noting that the law codes of the ancient Near East do share several structures with the suzerain vassal treaties. So there's a connection between these as literary styles. The idea of a historical preamble and blessings and curses, of course, also found in law codes like the laws of Hammurabi. What is interesting in the case of Deuteronomy is that there are also parallels with the specific features that are only found in the vassal treaties that relate to the position of Israel in relation to God. The end result, the book of Deuteronomy, is clearly adapted to the Israelite story, the context of the consolidation of cultic and economic power in Judah, and the theology of its time. So again, we're not dealing with a wholesale borrowing, but the adaptation of cultural forms in order to structure the texts that appear in the Bible. So we might not be able to pick out which treaties might have been known to the composer or composers of Deuteronomy. No matter what the connections, we might say that the book of Deuteronomy is a double example of the Bible being written backwards, both using earlier law traditions and earlier forms, textual forms, to compose a single Israelite and relevant law.